I want to talk about organizing through a recent story of really big success in Philadelphia. In 2016, I was working with a group of nurses at the Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia. I want to fast forward in the story to the point where we had already won, the nurses already won the vote to form a union in their hospital. But we were past that point. I was the chief negotiator for the contract. We were sitting in contract negotiations, and it became really clear that the employer had no interest in surrendering a penny or an ounce of control to these nurses, to these 1,000 nurses. So the conversation among the nurses became, we're going to have to get strike ready. To run and win a strike in the United States means that you have to get at least 90% of the nurses, or any of the workers, united and ready to take really high-risk action, to actually walk off the job under threat generally of being fired. So how do you get to 90% plus unity in a workforce where it's the employer themselves who hire people? It's like a cross-section of America. We have black nurses, we have white nurses, we have a handful of Latino nurses, but we have 1,000 nurses who, at that point, their only relationship is that they come to work together. They don't have a shared political identity. They're not being united. They're not showing up at meetings because they're longtime Facebook friends or because they tweet with each other. And we've got a problem in the campaign because we've got a very significant unit, significant in size. There's 66 nurses in a unit called telemetry. And the telemetry unit ran the anti-union campaign during the union election. So now we're in contract negotiations. We're trying to figure out, we've got to win over telemetry, or the nurses understand that we can't get anywhere close to a 90% or north of 95% of 1,000 nurses ready to walk out in a strike in this hospital so that they can make profound positive change in their life, which is what winning a good union contract can actually do. So we've got to figure out how to move the telemetry unit. We began to make a plan, which was to try and understand which nurses seem to have the most respect among their colleagues in the telemetry unit. Because it's the nurses ultimately who actually have the most respect among their colleagues who are going to have the best possibility to bring along the rest of their coworkers to shift from an anti-union position to a pro-union position. So we began to dig into the work. Which nurses knew which nurses. We began to build real social relationships, and I am not talking about the kind of social relationships that we're describing when we think about Facebook or Twitter feeds or Instagram or social media. I mean in real life, what were the actual relationships among and between the nurses, the 66 nurses in the telemetry unit? This was like a daily work for all of us, meaning all the nurses. We would sit together and figure out who listened to who carpooled with who sat together in the break room, who came down to the cafeteria together, how many came down to the cafeteria together, who had the largest number of colleagues sitting with them, if they were able to actually get a lunch break. And what we concluded was that there was one very important nurse on the day shift, and that day shift nurse was named Marnay Payne. Marnay had literally, unfortunately, led the Vote No campaign to the union several months earlier. So most of the nurses were sort of throwing up their hands and thinking, well, Jane, I mean, how are we ever going to move Marnay Payne, right? She actually led the anti-union campaign. We can't move Marnay Payne from a hardcore anti-union position to a super pro-union position. And in fact, they do. So how do they do it? They begin to work with Marnay Payne to try and figure out what's the 1, 2, or 3 things that Marnay Payne really wants to change about her day job at the hospital that she can't actually change on her own. Now, the parallel to this, there's a really interesting process happening, which is that one nurse from telemetry and one nurse only, a nurse named Liz Miller, had been coming to our meetings this whole time. The entire time, one nurse out of 66 was showing up at union meetings. Liz Miller, she is the type of human being that I think everyone would love if they met her. She sings, she can pull out a guitar, she is the Pennsylvania state chapter leader of the National Songwriters Association, she's funny, she's a feminist, she remembers and tells stories about when the nurses walked into the management teams in the late 1970s and said, we're not coming to work in skirts anymore, okay? She can get the whole room laughing. Unfortunately, what Liz Miller couldn't do was get any of her coworkers to come to take high risk and challenge Marnay Payne and decide that they were going to challenge their employers and become pro-union. In the context of organizing, this plays out constantly in our country. So how do we get Marnay Payne, who holds the respect of our coworkers and who becomes a linchpin in our strategy for the nurses to change their lives, as up against someone named Liz Miller, who's like an activist in telemetry. Liz Miller is a classic and wonderful, beautiful activist in this story. She just can't get anyone to do anything. She's willing, she's ready, she comes to every meeting, but she can't actually produce the majority membership of the telemetry unit that we believe that Marnay Payne on the day shift can. And Marnay, again, is anti-union. So what happens over the next several weeks is that the nurses dig in. They think through every single relationship that every single nurse has to Marnay Payne. They figure out what is the one thing that Marnay Payne wants to win or change in her unit that she cannot change by simply requesting it nicely with a smile on her face of top management. We find out that that one thing is literally not being mandated to take call. Now, for folks who don't know what call means that nurses have no private time in their lives. They leave hospitals and the boss can call them at any time. Like literally, you're on call. So you can't go to dinner, you can't hang out with your friends, you can't have a cocktail, you can't do all the normal things that people want. You can't go hiking, you can't put your phone down. And the telemetry nurses, like the rest of the nurses in the hospital, were all being routinely put on call. Once the nurses understood that the single most important issue to Marnay Payne for her and people in her unit in telemetry was that they no longer wanted to have to be mandated to stay on call, the nurses had their in. They had the issue that they could begin to work with Marnay on. And to make a long story short, after a ton of face-to-face conversations in the cafeteria, in the break rooms, at the time clock, all sorts of nurses mapping all of their relationships to Marnay, Marnay Payne literally one day rings up a coworker and says, "I'm ready to sign the union membership card." At the point at which Marnay Payne was prepared to flip from being anti-union to pro-union, we actually said to her that very day, "It's not enough for you, Marnay, to just sign the card, though we understand it's a really important day in your life. You're going to have to actually get the other 65 nurses in your unit, day shift and night shift, themselves to sign union membership cards, because we believe you're the only one who can do it at this point." Marnay Payne, within 14 hours, had a majority of the nurses in her unit signed up on union membership cards and would go on 2.5 months later to become the leader of the Vote Yes to Strike authorization at Einstein Medical Center. And we go on to win an amazing contract at Einstein in December of 2016. That's organizing. And that happens by no other means than nurses themselves taking direct action, face-to-face, methodically, forgetting about Facebook, forgetting about tweeting, and actually engaging in really hard conversations with each other about real issues and making a change. There are 3 takeaways from the story about how nurses were able to make profound changes in their lives and win a tremendous contract at Einstein. And the 3 takeaways are this. 1, we have to be patient and deliberate and disciplined in trying to understand which colleague of ours, which community member, in this case, which coworker, which nurse, held the most respect among her peers. And we may find that that person is not someone who is with us initially at all. So 1 is patient and persistent identification of the most respected leader. And that person may not be someone who's talking to us. Point 2, once we identify who that person is, we actually have to figure out what matters to them. We have to come to understand their initial self-interest. What is it that Marnay wanted to change in her unit, in her hospital, that she couldn't change alone by simply going to have a conversation with a manager? And that issue, of course, became not being mandated to be on call. So the 3rd takeaway is that we can't shy away from having to have some really hard conversations. In this case, the nurses who were approaching Marnay to have the conversations with her were met by hostility, indifference on a good day, hostility on bad days. Marnay would slam the door in their face. She would say, "I don't want to talk to you." And the nurses persisted. To me, that's a bit of a metaphor for what has to happen across the United States right now in very large numbers, which is that people have to be willing to have really hard and really challenging and really hard conversations with the neighbors, co-workers and fellow members of their parishes and congregations, etc. If we aren't willing to have really difficult conversations with people who are initially not engaging in a campaign to make something better, we can't just walk away. In fact, in a union campaign, those nurses could not just walk away. And the result was that Marnay Payne went on to lead the vote yes to a massive strike authorization in a major hospital in Philadelphia, and the nurses won a tremendous first contract that changed their lives at work and at home.